You know, they say that imitation is the highest form of flattery. Well, if that's the case, then Tamiya should be blushing. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale US M551 Sheridan tank. The model in this video here is built for my own personal collection and it's not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built mostly out of the box. However, I went ahead and deviated from the kit components on a few areas in terms of both detailing as well as also functionality. We'll be going over all these modifications and additions in this video. Not to mention, we'll also go ahead and review the base starter kit. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of content coming right at you. To start this video off, let's take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle is the M551 Sheridan. The Sheridan was a airborne assault vehicle slash armored reconnaissance vehicle that was developed by the US military in the early 1960s timeframe. This vehicle came to being for a multitude of different reasons. One of them was at this time the US military really was looking for a suitable light tank. During this era, the US military still had their armor corps divided into three groups, where you had a heavy tank, a medium tank, as well as a light tank. For the light tank role, this was being fulfilled by the M41 Walker Bulldog. However, by the early 1960s, the M41 was really starting to show its age. Something else that led to the development of this vehicle was the need to give airborne troops some sort of armor support. This was based upon lessons learned during World War II, where paratroopers in general are really vulnerable in that they don't really have any sort of armor support. And obviously this lends to some issues. It's really difficult to come up with a vehicle that has significant armor protection, however be light enough to either be airdropped via parachute or possibly even be able to be stowed inside of a glider. During World War II, there was the M22 Locust that was developed, but that's really a topic for another video. Fast forward to the 1960s, at this point there have been a lot of breakthroughs with new sorts of technologies, one of which was the use of aluminum plating for armor protection. By the use of this new material, you can get the vehicle's weight cut down significantly to where it becomes feasible to have it be air mobile. Along with this new armor, the vehicle was going to be armed with the new state-of-the-art ordnance of the era. At this time, the military was at a crossroads where they didn't really know exactly what the future was going to be for its main tank armament. If they should stick with conventional rifle gun barrels or go with a new-fangled anti-tank missile system. Around the same time, the US military was working with West Germany on the MBT-70 program, and one of the technologies that came out of that was the Shalehi missile. The Shalehi missile system itself was also an interesting choice. The unit was a very large diameter bore at about 152 millimeters. And what was equally as interesting was that it had a dual purpose system. The unit can fire the anti-tank missile, which was deemed to have excellent armor penetration, but also it was able to fire conventional ammunition. So basically you're getting the best of both worlds. Another benefit of the Shalehi system was it was considerably lighter compared to some of the other conventional arms of the period. Another capability that the Sheridan was going to feature was the ability to be fully amphibious. The Sheridan had these collapsible screens that were built into the vehicle, and when the opportunity arose, they would be built, and then the vehicle can then ford across a river or a lake or whatever large body of water was in its path. In addition to the Sherman DD type screen, the vehicle had these large foam ballast tanks that were integrally built into the side of the hull. It's because of these large ballast tanks why the Sheridan's outward appearance has the shape that we all know and come to recognize. For the vehicle's power plant, it utilized a Detroit diesel 6V53T 6-cylinder turbocharged diesel engine, which output about 300 horsepower. And of course the Sheridan only weighed in at a little over 15 tons. This engine was able to get the Sheridan moving at full speed to about 43 miles an hour. The vehicles were approved for service and entered into production in 1966. The vehicles remained in production until 1970. The vehicles were eventually sent off to Vietnam, where they performed as good as really any other vehicle of the era, although compared to the M48 Patton, they were a little underpowered for the job at hand. Post-Vietnam, the Sheridan wasn't exactly known to be a popular vehicle. I've met a few Sheridan guys that served during this time period, and basically all of them have the same type of stories and experiences with this vehicle. During this time, the vehicle was known to be really unreliable, and they were not kept in great condition. Basically, they would scavenge parts from other vehicles just to keep one or two of them running, and basically if you were stuck on the other vehicles in the motor pool, you're basically going to be walking for the rest of your service. As a quick little antidote, I have a story from one of my friends who was on the Sheridan at this time, and basically he was originally an M60A1 crewman, and then at some point they offered him the Sheridan. When he first saw the Sheridan, he fell in love with it. He said, quote, "It looked like a little Corvette. It was sleek, it was sexy, it looked fast, had that giant gun on it, and it looked awesome." Shortly after joining the Sheridan crew, he quickly realized how much of a mistake that was, because the things just weren't that reliable. However, to be fair, this was more or less the absolute state of the Army of the period as a reflection on the Sheridan as a whole. The mid to late 1970s really was a bad time to be in the US military, and spoiler alert, if the Russians wanted to go across the Fulda Gap, I think they could probably pull it off. Although the 1970s marked a low point in the Sheridan's career, it was far from being career-ending. During the 1980s, when the military was rebuilt, the Sheridan was one of the carryover vehicles that continued in service. During the 1980s and even into the 1990s, the Sheridan was deployed to several hotspots, one of which was in Panama, and then most notably, the Sheridan did see service during the First Gulf War. By the mid-1990s, the Sheridan was really becoming a heavily antiquated tank design. Keep in mind, at this point, the Shalehi missile system was no longer in operation with the other branches of the US military, and basically what kept the Sheridan around for as long as it has was the fact that it filled that interesting niche role for being armor support for airborne troops. However, by the late 1990s, the Sheridan itself was completely phased out of US military service. But that wasn't necessarily true. Although the Sheridan was retired with the US military in the late 1990s, it didn't really end at that point. The vehicle continued to see extremely limited service, with the US military being an OPFOR training vehicle for the National Training Center. The National Training Center, of course, is this large swath of desert where tankers go to practice maneuvers and exercises with opposing forces. The opposing forces would have originally intended to have Soviet-made vehicles, but for the longest period of time, they would take the Sheridan, add body kits to them to have them resemble the T-72. This vehicle served in this role for a number of years, up until, I believe, 2003 or so, when they were officially retired from that role as well. However, I'm pretty sure there might be one or two of them floating around. If anyone does know for certain, feel free to throw that into the comments section listed below. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplied you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1980s vintage Academy Minicraft M551 Sheridan. In a nutshell, this model here is a knockoff of the Tamiya 1/35 scale M551 Sheridan airborne tank that came out in the early to mid 1970s. Back during the early, or I should say the late 70s to the early 80s time frame, there was this new upstart model company located in South Korea called Academy. Academy didn't exactly have a whole lot of money for their own tooling, so what they went ahead and did was they just basically took kits from other manufacturers, made copies of them, and started selling them as their own with a much reduced price tag compared to the original offering. Yes, it is pretty shady, but this is how Academy got off the ground. Now, Academy used this business practice for not just their 1/35 scale AFV lineup, but they also use it for several other kits that they were releasing during this period. In fact, if anyone is a super fan of the channel, you'll remember that back in 2015, the first Academy Minicraft white box kit review that I've ever done was on the 1/48 scale West German Canon. And if you watch that video and get up to the point where I review the kit contents, you can quite clearly see how the model is quite clearly a carbon copy from the Tamiya tooling. And this model here is basically going to follow along similar lines. The kits from this era, like I stated before, were introduced by Academy towards the end of the 70s and throughout the 1980s. The kits were in production for a good number of years until the end of the 1980s, to which at that point there, Academy decided to phase out production of the older carbon copy Tamiya kits that they had in their catalog. From that point onward, Academy had enough money and capital on hand to invest in their own tooling kits, as well as to make some improvements to the current carbon copy kits that they had on hand. The 1990s releases are going to emulate this, like for instance their M48A5 kit, as well as their M60A1 Rise kit with the reactive armor. Those models are really nothing more than polished up versions from the Tamiya kits, but Academy put their own little slant on it. Back to the Sheridan, it wouldn't be until about 2005 or so when Academy would come back to the market with a 1/35 scale M551 Sheridan. Only that kit was made with 100% new tooling by Academy and shares nothing in common with the old legacy counterpart that we have here. Another thing I want to point out about these kits is that just like what Tamiya was doing in the early 1970s, where they would release the kit in two types of formats, where we would have one version with the two-way wire remote, and that one would have a nice, beautiful box art, and the other version would either be static or single motor, and would have a simplistic type box art setup. Well, Academy did something very, very similar. Along the late 70s and the early 1980s time frame, they did the exact same type of setup where we would have the same type of kit tooling, but one version would have a two-way wire remote with a much more elaborate box art setting, and then you would have the static version like we have here with this plain Jane simplistic type setup. Well, unfortunately, this kit here isn't going to be as cool as that one because this is the white box Academy Minicraft release of this kit. Back during the 1980s time frame, Minicraft was the company that were importing the Academy kits and distributing them in the United States. Academy Minicraft would be working together for a good number of years, about 20 years or so. However, in recent years, Minicraft no longer does the importation for the Academy kits. Instead, in recent years, Academy kits have been picked up by MRC, which that name should sound familiar, specifically if you watch this YouTube channel, because MRC for the longest time used to import the kits from Tamiya. Then when Tamiya USA showed up in California, they lost the ability to import those kits, to which then MRC hooked up with Academy and have been distributing their kits literally ever since. Throughout the 1980s time frame, Academy Minicraft kits had this type of a box art to them, or lack thereof. This is not just true for their AFV kits, but also true for their airplane and ship kits as well. When it comes to the AFV kits, we just have this white background with a photograph of the built vehicle in question. And you know what? As simplistic as this type of layout is, you got to give them credit. At least there isn't any false advertising. What you see here is literally the kit that you get and pretty much builds into. Because, as many of us know, the quality of the detailing on the box art in many cases far exceeds the quality found on the plastic kit on the inside. And in one case in particular, namely on the Aurora 1/48 scale M46 patent tank, the box art for the longest period of time featured a tank that was completely different compared to the one that you get in the box. But that's really a story for another video and of another day. Back to the Sheridan that we have here. Here you can see the built model. Note, it is very simplistically built. You can see some really bad silvering on these decals over here. The model itself is built purely out of the box. And the pattern that you see here is some kind of a summer verdant version of the Merc camouflage scheme, which is accurate for a M551 Sheridan, specifically during this time frame when the Army basically had a bunch of older vehicles on hand and they were throwing Merc patterns on all of them. In fact, there is a dedicated Merc pattern specifically for the Sheridan. From the vehicle takes to the typography, here we just have some basic information. U.S. Army tank. Technically it should be a U.S. airborne tank, but who's judging? We have this green trim here, the Academy Minicraft logo. It's 1/35 scale. And that's it for the main box art. On the side here, we have another shot of the vehicle from a different angle. Some information on the size of the model. And some brief information on the vehicle in question. As well as some other corporate information. And on the reverse side, we have the exact same information. Side tab here brings us to this type of a setup. This is kit number 1307. And that's really pretty much it. This kit here is a recent addition to the stash. I picked it up off of eBay a few months ago, and I picked it up for anywhere between 15 to about 23 US dollars. These white box Academy Minicraft kits are something that are generally not as desirable as the Tamiya counterparts, and because of that, when they are found in the wild, can, for most occasions, be acquired for a really good price. However, there's always that one person out there that quote-unquote knows what he's got, and he's going to raise and inflate the prices accordingly. So this is something you want to be aware of. I will also say that a number of years ago, these white box Academy kits tend to have been more prolific. However, in the recent decades, since the 1980s timeframe, the kits have been a bit on the rarer side compared to some of the other kit offerings out there. Having said that, however, these kits are far from being extremely rare, and they do tend to pop up on places like eBay from time to time. Okay, cracking open the box, we'll reveal the kit contents, and if you have ever built the old school Tamiya M551 Sheridan kit, this here should be complete and utter deja vu. Starting with the hull. All of the kit's contents are made in this olive drab plastic, and this is a feature that is generally found on these older pattern of Academy kits. The Tamiya kits of this era utilize a dark green type coloring. If anyone has seen my vintage Tamiya M651 build, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The Academy kits of the era had this olive drabby type plastic, and it's one of those things when you see it, you instantly know what you're looking at. Now, in later years, Tamiya would change plastic to a shade similar to this, but it's still slightly different. Starting with the molding and detailing, you can see that to Academy's credit, they basically copied the Tamiya kit absolutely perfectly. All of the original detailing is integrally found on and is molded pretty clean. There aren't any flash or any other type of imperfections which are found on lower end plastic kits, and this one here doesn't really seem to be the case. There goes the bow plane found on the front. Again, what you see here is exactly what you would see on the Tamiya kit tooling. Nice thick plastic, pretty sturdy. Here's one difference, however. You'll see, of course, it's made in Korea, as opposed to made in Japan or made in the Philippines, which, of course, is seen on the Tamiya kits. I believe on the Tamiya one, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the injection pin mark locations are slightly different, but again, this has to do with the way Academy went ahead and made their molds. And that's really it for the upper hull. Note on this kit here, the tow cable is integrally molded in. This is, again, as per the Tamiya tooling. And on the lower hull here, you can see that just like with the Tamiya tooling, the Academy one kept the motorization aspect of the build. Like I stated before, Academy did release this kit in a dual motorized format, which recycling the old Tamiya motorization points would be very useful in that respect. Go with the battery clip mounts, little pictograms of the batteries. Quite standard for older kits of this era. Oh, looks like there's a little bit of damage over here, but it's not broken or anything, just a little bit of stress on those two locations. These areas are made from pretty thin plastic, so it's to be expected, but the piece is in good shape. Here you see the lower chassis components. Note the shock absorber, the swing arms. Again, very simplistic kit for people who are used to building kits for today, but keep in mind this tooling here dates back to the early 1970s originally. On the bottom here, you have the little motorization robot face. And here we have the Academy information. And older kits of this period would have this type of a layout, where you have Academy Plastic Model Company, and then the exact same information written in Korean, but it would be in this type of typeface. Of course, made in Korea. That's basically it. Next runner takes us to the turret. Again, anyone's used to the Tamiya tooling, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. I don't remember if the Tamiya kit has this type of a runner setup, or if Academy went ahead and tweaked the runners so it better fits their molding machines. But the part themselves are basically carbon copies of the Tamiya kits, including the loader's hatch, which is integrally molded to the top portion of the turret. Note that how old this kit is. The little rubber band which holds the tracks together has completely dry rotted away. But the tracks themselves are still in perfectly good shape. And yes, these are the single piece vintage tracks, made from a material which is very similar to the Tamiya ones. Slightly different, but both of them will give you the exact same result. With the tracks out of the bag, get a better view of the detailing found on the surface. Just like with the other Tamiya kits from the 70s time frame, the tracks are going to be simplistic compared to what we expect to see on tracks of today, but they do give you the overall look and feel of the tracks in question. Here you can see they have the little wings that are on the end, which is found on the Sheridan tracks, along with the two little rubber pads found on the track face. On the inside here, there are no interior track link detailing, but we do have a double set of guide horns, which is found on the tracks for the M551 Sheridan. Like I stated before, the Academy material for the tracks is slightly stiffer compared to the ones found in the Tamiya kits, but the material itself is, again, more than suffice for the job at hand. And as we can recall from the M48A3 build that I've done, where I made that one motorized, it does the job equally as well as the original Tamiya tracks do. On the turret here, you get to see more of the surface detailing. Now, I believe there is an error with the overall shape of the turret on the old school Tamiya kits, and this is something that Tamiya themselves have fixed on their new tooling version of the Sheridan kits that came out about a year or so ago. But back in the 70s, this is what you got. Again, as for the molding quality, Academy did a pretty good job. There's not really, like I said before, any imperfections or excessive flash or anything else that you generally find on some poor quality of injection molds. Digging down deeper takes to the running gear. Now that I opened up the bag, the room smells like a vintage model kit, which is a wonderful smell indeed. Okay, so pulling this out, here we got, a little wheel fell off, but that's okay. Here you can see the quality of details found on the road wheels. Note all of the fasteners are there, and even for the tooling of the day are molded pretty well. Same can also be said about the sprocket and the idler wheels. Note the holes on this one here are molded flat, and this is something that I'm probably going to address as the build continues with the pin vise. But on these older kits, what you see is basically what you get. The runner itself, by the way, is identical to the Tamiya one. The only difference is the little tab that we have up here, where Academy went ahead and changed some of the verbiage found on the top, as well as the company information. Also in the bag, we have here a set of polycaps, and the pieces themselves are, again, a copy of the Tamiya tooling, but the composition of the polycaps are a lot stiffer compared to the black material that we see on the Tamiya kits. Also in this baggie over here, we have some metal components. On the old school Sheridan kits, the front idler wheels were bolted on with metal axle arms, which was a feature that's pretty interesting, and I believe was one done specifically for motorization use, because with the metal arm here, it's much more rugged and can take up the abuse of motorization running. Even though the kits were eventually made static, and this is true for the Tamiya ones as well, they still gave you these little pieces. And this is probably some of the reasons why both Tamiya and Academy phase these kits out, because actually manufacturing these metal bits over here probably ended up costing too much in the long run, so they phased them out. But you can see them right here in this parts bag, along with the metal fasteners. Going down deeper takes to some turret components, and what's pretty cool is that Academy went ahead and stapled this little banner across the top portion here of the bag. You know, a little bit of marketing goes a long way. It's still pretty cool to get this on screen though. This is something that you would see dropped on the Academy releases that came after this era that we have here. Here we have all those little 50 caliber ammo cans, which are an iconic bit of detailing found on the Sheridan side portion of the turret. Cupola hatch, brush guards, smoke grenade launchers, which kind of look like Law anti-tank rockets, but rest assured these are just smoke grenade launchers. Basically everything you need to equip the turret. And here's the runner now without it being trapped in its little highly reflective bag, so you get a better idea on what the parts look like. Here's the mantlet. Definitely has the look and feel of the Sheridan's mantlet. There's the M2 HB 50 caliber machine gun. Note it's integrally molded onto a 50 caliber cradle, and this is one part of the kit that definitely does show its age, and it's one part that really didn't age all that well. But, you know, you get a simple machine gun with it. Here we have the main gun. It is in a two-piece assembly, which of course is customary for 1/35 scale model kits. Shovel, some other lift points, taillights, idler mounts, basically everything you need to assemble the remainder of the details of the model. And even the front driver's hatch, which spins on the Sheridan, but I'll touch upon that as the build continues. Towards the bottom of the box, here we have a set of decals. These decals here are identical to the ones found on the original Tamiya Sheridan kit. Surprise, surprise. Only the quality of these decals are not nearly as good as the Tamiya ones. This is one aspect of these older Academy kits that aren't really the best, and honestly, I'm probably not going to be utilizing these on this build. So we'll see as that progresses. And down towards the bottom of the box here, we have the instruction sheet, and this is something that's going to be pretty cool. Now, the Academy instruction sheets are much more condensed compared to the Tamiya ones, but they basically just took the Tamiya ones and scanned them and basically just reorganized them. So here you go. What's usually a nice little booklet found on the Tamiya kits, on the Academy, nah, more abridged. Basically, everything you need to go right here in about 4 or 5 simple steps. And the same is true for the reverse side on the turret. It just shows you just how much fluff are in those Tamiya instructions. But one thing that's really, really interesting I want to point out, and that's on the bottom here, we have a nice illustration of an M551 Sheridan. And if anyone knows anything about old plastic model kits, you'll know that this here is the box art from the Tamiya kit. Yes, when you buy the Tamiya vintage M551 Sheridan kit, this is the box art that you got for the standard white box version. So that's kind of cool that they went ahead and basically not only jacked the kit, but also jacked the illustration as well. Well, now that you saw what all the kit supplied components are, let me go ahead and describe the extra bit of equipment that I'm going to be adding to this kit over here to take it further from the stock offering. Although the stock model builds into a really quick and simple rendition of the M551, in my opinion, the stock static kit is missing something. And it's something that is actually inherent to this kit, and building it without it, you're really kneecapping yourself. And that is not to build it as a static model. Instead, I'm going to go ahead and motorized convert it. These old Tamiya kits here really do beckon to be made motorized. They were originally intended for it, and when you're building them static, it's almost like a little piece of them is missing. And in order to motorized convert this, I'm going to utilize my typical tried and true formula with using the Tamiya twin motor gearbox. If anyone has ever watched the other static motorized converted models that are found on this channel, you'll note that this system is used basically all the time because, well, it works really, really well for the job at hand. These gearboxes are really easy to track down, they're very affordable, and on top of that, they work very, very, very well. Because they are dual motor powered, you do have a lot of power going into the track drive system, which gives it some pretty decent propulsion. The units themselves can also be rigged to be radio controlled if you're good enough, because they are a dual motor system and you need a dual motor format in order to properly make a tank like this radio controlled. However, I'll leave that to the RC, or I should say the micro tank RC experts, and for this one here I'm just going to roll with simple motorization. Starting with the model suspension, all of the running gear components are the kit supply ones and were basically utilized. The road wheels themselves were mounted on without any problems and were assembled out of the box. Just like with the Tamiya counterpart, the Academy one uses polycaps as a way to secure the wheels to the axles, but it allows the wheels to fully rotate. Because this model here was converted to be motorized, it is something that was definitely appreciated. One interesting quirk that the Tamiya pattern of Sheridan kits have is that by the time you're done with the build, you will have 2 complete road wheels left over. And by complete, I mean literally complete, which would include boat halves and even the polycaps that go on the inside. Not sure how Tamiya made this oversight, but it's an interesting quirk nonetheless, and it is something that carried over into the Academy counterpart that we have here. While on the running gear, one mod that I did make to this model here was involving the front idler. The idler does have these perforations that are found on the wheel surface, and they are present on the old school kit. However, they are just indentations and are molded solid. On this one here, with the help of a pin vise, I just simply drilled them out. This was done to both sides, obviously improving the look of the model overall. As for the track, well, like in my typical type format, I went ahead and weathered it in the condition that you see it here. Just like with all the other American tank tracks, the Sheridan tracks are comprised of both metal and rubber components. The metal components are all painted to have their surface rust type weathering, while the rubber components are obviously painted to look like worn rubber. On the Sheridan, the rubber would consist of 2 pads here on the track face, and then on the inner portion, right over here, there would be a rubber block found on either side of the track tooth. This is something to keep in mind when you're building any Sheridan kit, to remember that the track consists of these following materials. Although on this kit here, there are no real hinge details found on the inside portion of the track, by just painting it with a swipe of black paint on either side of the tooth, this gives the illusion of the rubber portions being present. And it's a real easy way to improve the look of an older kit like this, whose track may not necessarily have the full interior sections molded in. Before I depart from the running gear, I just want to point out some of the weathering done to the road wheels. On this one here, I went ahead and utilized a technique which is seen on a few other builds on this channel, where I simulate the bearings being worn out and you're going to have some oil dripping out from the recesses. Note that when I utilize this technique, I don't utilize it on every single wheel in the same format. Some wheels just have a little bit of sweat going on around the hubcap, while others we have more of a substantial leak. By utilizing this technique, this is a way to give your model a little bit extra spice, but you don't want to overdo it by having every road wheel with the same type of leakage going on. Some of the road wheels are left completely stock, where, the bearings haven't worn out yet. As for the technique itself, this is done via the paintbrush. The black lines and the sweater applied via Tamiya Gloss Black, and then afterwards, to give it just a little bit more extra sheen, I go over all these sections again with Tamiya Gloss Lacquer. Moving up takes to the front details. Nothing really much to talk about over here. All the details you see here are stock out of the box, and were just simply utilized as such. When it comes to the headlights, note they are painted in this format, and this is something that is a constant on many of the vehicles from this era. One thing that I always found really cool about the Sheridan tank family is with the front driver's hatch. It opens up in a very unique and really specific way. Unlike most hatches that have a hinge on them, the Sheridan's driver hatch opens up in a reminiscent way to very old school fast food restaurant drive-thrus, where the entire unit basically just pivots like you see here. And what's cool is that the old school kits from Tamiya and Academy in this case are fully functional. Now in this model here, there's no interior detailing, but the kit originally had a little driver's chair and a figure that would have sat in it. So that when you open up the hatch on the original kit, you do have the figure there waiting for you. Because this model here is motorized, I needed that extra space on the inside to house the batteries, so the little chair had to go. And as for the figure, well, I never put figures in my models anyway, so that guy was doomed to spend the eternity in the spare figure bin. However, at least the tank does have a cool functional hatch capability. Last bit of detailing I want to mention on the front involves the bow plane. This is one bit of extra detailing that I added that didn't require all that much work, but really improved the look of the model tenfold. You see, of course, the Sheridan itself was designed to be fully amphibious, where the sections here would open up, concealing a rubberized skirt. It would elevate in place, much along the lines of the World War II Sherman DDs on D-Day. Well, on the front section over here, we had this bow plane that would pivot up, and in order for the driver to see, there was a little viewport found on this section. Well, all of this detailing is molded in the retracted state, obviously, on this kit, and the viewfinder is present, but obviously it's just, molded solid. One way to improve this was to add the viewport plexiglass detailing. This was fabricated out of a thin piece of clear styrene left over from a blister pack of cookies or some sort or another. But what I did was I carefully cut it out to the shape of the square and then just glued it in place. This is the best way to simulate the clear plexiglass found on the real vehicle, as it's literally a real piece of clear plastic. On some builds out there, I've seen people try numerous type of tricks where they would paint it silver or they would put gloss paint on the inside. Both of these procedures are less than ideal, and honestly the best thing to do is to rummage your recycle bin for a piece of clear plastic and just fabricate it out of that. As for the piece being glued in, I use a few drops of white glue on certain locations just so that it dries in a nice clean manner and it leaves for a seamless result. This technique is not just relevant for these old school kits that we have here, but also I believe might be of use on some of the newer tooling kits that have been released in recent years. Moving our way to the rear, nothing much to talk about here. All the components you see are supplied with the kit. Rather than amputating some of the molded in details like the tow cable, I just went ahead and worked with them and carefully painted around them to the way that you see here. The remainder of the tools went on, again, without any problems. One thing to mention that on the Sheridan is that this little box that we have here is your exhaust manifold, and so you need to weather that accordingly. Also, one thing I want to mention involves the back portion here. We have these two straps that are integrally molded on, and just for a little bit extra pop, I went ahead and painted them with the olive green nylon webbing like what we see on several other military vehicles of the period. Same is also going to be true for the other portions of webbing that are found on this vehicle, namely the ones here on the rear rack. And I guess that's a perfect way to lead us to the turret. Starting with the rack, again, all stock components, and these pieces of webbing were simply mounted as per the kit. Some people would argue that these are probably one of the weaker aspects of the kit, to which I don't necessarily disagree with that. If you are working on one of these models and you really want to take it up to the next level, you can easily fabricate these out of thin strips of aluminum or some other type of material. For this model, however, the stock ones were simply utilized as is. For the paintwork, just like I mentioned before, they were painted to replicate that olive green webbing, which is, again, found on military vehicles of this period. Moving towards the sides of the turret takes us some of the more iconic detailing found on the Sheridan. That is the sheer number of 50 caliber ammo cans that are found on the sides. All of the cans themselves are stocked with the kit and were just painted and utilized out of box. Just like with the other webbing, the webbing that is molded into the ammo cans was carefully painted with the same colors that I just mentioned. And when it comes to mounting the boxes to the side, there are some, I guess, suggestion points integrally molded into the turret. However, you have some flexibility with this, just with the way the kit, fully builds out. So if you're working on one of these and the boxes are lining up exactly to the suggestion points, fear not, just basically use them more or less as guidelines and you should be perfectly fine. The jerry can itself, however, did receive a slight modification. That was to the cap section that we have here. The cap was not integrally molded on, so I went ahead and fabricated it out of the head of a nail. By adding this, it's another one of those quick little details that improves the look overall. Moving along takes to the smoke grenade launchers, and these are the kit original ones that were simply mounted out of the box. The kit's detailing are actually really, really good, again, considering the age of the tooling, and in my opinion, hold up even to today. When it comes time for painting them, you want to be aware that the end sections are actually rubber caps, and so you want to paint them accordingly. This brings us to the mantlet. The mantlet did receive some modifications compared to the way we saw the vehicle from the unboxing. On this section over here, there was a small little bit of detailing that was molded on. However, for a Sheridan tank from this era, that bit of detailing wouldn't be there. So it was amputated away, leaving for the smooth look that we have here. On the Sheridan, this, by the way, is your coaxial machine gun, so you want to weather that accordingly. On this side, here we have an optical device, and if you'll notice, I added this little guard that we have here. This is absent on the stock kit and was fabricated out of a piece of plastruck tubing. The piece was just cut to shape and mounted without any problems. On the inside portion, there is a small hole present. I'm not sure if that was something that was integrally molded on or if it was something I added via the pin vise, but that is something, again, to keep in mind. Moving us further takes us to the turret roof, and this is where the majority of the detail mods were applied. Starting with the well beads, you'll notice that on all of these locations here, well beads have been sculpted. All of these details were not present on the original tooling of this model, and the addition of them is a really great way to improve the look and to really bring it up to the next level. The welds themselves are sculpted out of red putty, and the technique that I utilized on this model here is the same technique that I showcased on the Old Tank Repair M4A3E8 Sherman video that I posted a little while ago. If you're interested to know how I pulled it off, I recommend checking out that video. On this portion of the turret, you can see some of the other details that were added. Starting with the lift handle on the loader's hatch. The loader's hatch did originally have this detailing present, however, like in true Tamiya fashion, it was just a simple blade that was molded onto the hatch. This blade was polished away, and I went ahead and drilled out two new locations via a pin vise and a small bit, and then a handle was fabricated out of some thin floor wire. While on the floor wire, it takes us to the antenna bases. This one here is a resin casting, and I've mentioned this little bit of equipment on a few other of my videos, and I just went ahead and dropped it on this model here. The kit, I don't believe, had an antenna base, if I can recall, and if it did, it was going to be very simplistic in its overall shape and detailing, so I replaced it with this counterpart here. Of course, the antenna wires themselves are made from thin floor wire, and that leads us to the front antenna base. The front antenna base is another American pattern post-World War II mount, and this one actually has a rubber section that the antenna would then plug into. For this model here, I rendered it where the rubber section is present, but the other antenna wire just isn't connected. This antenna base is common on many post-World War II American tanks, and it's still utilized today. So if you encounter something like this on your builds, be sure to add a little bit of wire on it just to give the look that you see here. Moving forward takes us to one of probably my favorite details found on the Sheridan, and it's also one that was really one of the weakest aspects of the old school Tamiya pattern kits, and that involves the front blower. You see, the kit does supply you with the front blower, however, it is wrong on just about every single level. The shape is off, the size is off, and even the surface detailing is off. Rather than trying to utilize that piece, I decided to address it and to fix that problem on this model. The one that we see here is a new HD 3D printed component that I designed, and I actually have it for sale on my Shapeways store. Because the piece is 1/35 scale, it doesn't exactly fit on the remainder of my catalog, so like with the other smaller scale parts that I've announced over the last few months, it's found on the ECA Shapeways page. With the way the set is designed, you actually have two bits of detailing. You have the blower, and you also have this little handle that we have right here. I'll touch upon that in a moment. As for the blower, it has all the appropriate detailing for this bit of equipment. This would include the shape and size of the blower itself, along with the little splash guard that we have along the rim. The blower is also fully hollow, so that when it gets fully painted and weathered, you get to see the little gap found on the bottom portion, and it just gives it a little bit more extra realism. The piece is a drop-in installation, and really no other prep work is required. From the blower takes that other bit of equipment that I touched upon before, and that's this little handle that we have right here. I'm not sure if this is a handle or if it's a vane sight. If anyone is a former Sheridan guy, feel free to let me know specifically. However, this little bit of detailing is absent on the old school Tamiya kit, so I went ahead and designed it and tooled it up. The piece has the correct geometry of the real one, which consists of course, this boxy shape with that hollowed out section, but it also has the bent section with its mounting fasteners right there on the bottom. Hopefully this comes out on camera because it's really small, but again, this is just one of the advantages that HD 3D printing does offer. From this little handle type device takes us to the gunner's optic protective box. The protective box on the Sheridan was very similar in operation to, well, like a bread box that you would find in your kitchen. Basically, when not in use, this cover plate would be in the down position, and then when it needed to be utilized, this whole unit would just slide upward, revealing the optic on the inside. The kit does supply you with the box itself, but as one might imagine, it's very simplistic in its overall shape and detailing. So in order to improve it, I fabricated out of very thin styrene the end sections, as well as the face that we have here, and it's modeled in the closed position, so I don't have to go ahead and render out the optic found on the inside. It's a real simple way to get a little bit of detailing without having to do that much extra work. Finally, this takes to the commander's cupola, and this is again a very interesting bit of detailing found on this kit because it has some nice detailing to it, but it also has some really good functionality. First, the whole cupola itself can pivot just like the real one, and it's held in place with two little locking tabs, just like the way the turret is held on to the upper hull. One thing that's also really cool is that the hatches are fully functional, and on this model in particular, it has a really good function. The hatches just simply pivot open, has some minor interior detailing on it, but nothing really much to brag about. But on this particular model, you can see that this here is where I concealed the main power switch. Normally on my motorized models, the power switch is in the bottom or it's inside the hull in some way, shape, or form. For this one, I wanted to do something a little bit different. Originally, I wanted to have the power switch right here in the front so you get access to it by rotating the hatch in that really cool manner that I showed before. However, for some reason, I just didn't have the internal space to do that. So rather than going with that approach, I moved it up into the turret. So now, to turn on the model, simply open up the commander's cupola hatch, and there's the switch ready to go. I'll touch upon the functionality in a moment, but needless to say, it's actually one that's pretty convenient. From the cupola, it takes to the M2HB, and this is the kit supply one, and it's again probably one of the weaker aspects of this build. This is something that would really be improved if it was replaced with one of the aftermarket or 3D printed guns that are on the market. But for this one here, I decided to keep it because this one actually does have that little locking piece that we have here, which would be present on the real unit. For the machine gun itself, I actually took the kit one and, well, tried to improve it as much as possible. First thing that I did involved the handle. With the way the kit was originally, the spade grips in the back are just this overmolded solid block, really. So to improve it with a needle file, I went ahead and carved out the section over here, turning that square into two distinguishable spade grip sections. With a nail, I went ahead and added to the section over here, which everyone has seen a real M2HB. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about when there's a huge cylinder that descends from the back and the spade, or I should say the trigger sections are right on top of it. On the cooling shroud, I went ahead and drilled the sections out with a pin vise. This is a very risky procedure to make and one that you can easily screw up. So if you don't have the nerve or the tools to do it, it would be best just to skip it altogether. Same is also true for the muzzle section. On this one here, I did go ahead and drill that out. On the ammo can, I went ahead and, again, just kept the stock parts. The ammo can and the tray are two separate pieces, which is a nice touch, or a feature, I should say, specifically of the era. And I just went ahead with a small paintbrush and added the little yellow lettering, which of course would be found on ammo cans of this type. Possibly, if I was to do another Sheridan, I would replace this with another M2HB, and if anyone's curious what type of cradle mount that would work for this, it would use your standard M23 cradle mount, which there are several renditions out there in both plastic as well as also in 3D print. Not to mention resin, I believe, too. And this now leads us to the paint and the markings. For this one here, I wanted to go with a really early production version of the M55 Sheridan, which would have been from the mid-1960s time frame. For the main base coat, I went with my typical shade of dark olive drab. This is a color that I've touched upon on a few of my other model showcase videos. Keep in mind, for a U.S. military vehicle from the late 50s, early 1960s time frame, this shade would be more than appropriate. From there, I went ahead and lightened the surface up by utilizing a cocktail of different washes and filters, bringing it up to this shade that you see here. From there, the weathering is my usual format by using both dry brushing as well as airbrushing. For the markings, the kit does supply you with a set of water slide decals. However, like I touched upon before, they really weren't the best quality when new, and 30 plus years on from there, they didn't hold up well with age. Some of them just disintegrated upon impact of the water, so they were basically useless. However, I will say I lucked out with one of the markings, and that was the weight one that we have right here. That was supplied with the original decal sheet, and I lucked out on it because it went on without any problems. The remainder of the decals on this model here are just scrounged from my spare decal bin and are from a multitude of different manufacturers. I believe some are Dragon, some might be Tamiya, and I believe one set is actually from AFV Club. The 36, for some reason, sticks out to me. These markings went on without any problems and then secured on even better with the VMS flat varnish. I've touched upon that product on a few other videos in the past, and I cannot recommend it strongly enough. As you can see, the decals have absolutely no impurities or defects to them whatsoever. The VMS varnish worked like a champ, even on that crappy old school Academy marking that I touched upon before. Well, with all that out of the way, it's time to mention the last part of this build, which was the functionality aspect. Like I mentioned before, the model was converted from static to fully motorized. This isn't too much of a stretch because, again, the original kit was designed to be motorized from the get-go and was basically shoehorned into being static. So the addition of the gearbox was really not something that was that hard to do. In order to take the model apart, the designers who originally designed this kit here did it in a very good way. The model is held in the back by two rubber polycaps, and then there's a locking tab found on the front. Because of this system, the upper and lower hulls are held together with some pretty decent strength, but are not intrusive where you can tell that the model comes apart. With the way these things are designed, the seams line up on the appropriate seams which would be found on the real vehicle. To take the model apart, I just simply grab the back, lift up slightly, and then the entire upper just slides right off. With the top off, you can get to see the gearbox fitted in place. The Tamiya dual motor gearbox just drops directly in, and it's held in place via a couple fasteners found on the underside of the hull. In order to prevent the gearbox from twisting or yawing in any way, shape, or form, I went ahead and filled the sides in with silicone to really keep it in place. For the power source, I went with a 9-volt battery on this one. I was able to have it running on two AA batteries. However, I found that it gives you better performance with the 9-volt, and because this is a Sheridan, the real vehicle did have some pretty decent speed to it. Granted, you actually had a Sheridan that worked, but that's a conversation for another day. If you notice, because like I touched upon before, the switch is found in the turret, I went ahead and had to have this dual plug setup that you see here, just so that I could take the turret off fully from the model without having any sort of appendages linking it back to the lower hull. It does add a little bit of complexity, however, it is one that does work pretty well. With the way the model is designed, you're not really supposed to take the tank apart all that often. This is only done in an emergency type circumstance, and in order to do regular maintenance, i.e. change out the batteries, this can be facilitated by just popping off the turret and yanking the battery out from that point. When you're all done, the model goes together as simply as it came apart. Just like with many other motorized converted models on the channel, this one here has a 3-way switch, so the model can go both forward and in reverse. With the way this switch is set up, the center portion is off, and then in order to power it up, you just simply hit the switch, and off it wants to go. This is going in reverse, and there we see it in forward. And as you can see, combined with the 9-volt as well as with that dual motor gearbox, the model does have some pretty good speed to it. If I could get into focus, that is. One other thing I want to point out is that unlike some of the other motorized converted models that I've showcased on this channel, namely like that M48A3 that I recently completed, where after I ran that model, the paint on the tracks basically just disintegrated, and I actually had to repaint the tracks on that one. For this one here, that doesn't seem to be the case. The paint held up, or is holding up extremely well on this one, and for reasons that are basically escaping me. The tracks are made from the same type of materials as the other one, and are painted with the same paints and the same techniques, but for this one here, they're just holding up better. I'm not going to question it too much further, because I really don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth, but, you know, I'm just going to take that for what it is. And at the end of the day, I couldn't be any happier on how this build turned out. This was one of those builds that just went together without any problems, and it's just going to be a nice welcome addition to the collection. And of course, this leads us into skill level and recommendation. Although this model is the vintage Academy rendition of the M551 Sheridan, obviously it's basically the Tamiya kit, so everything that I'm going to be stating about this kit can also be applied to the old school Tamiya kits as well. One real positive attribute that these older kits have is their simplicity and their ease of assembly. These old kits here, they just go together with really not that much effort required by the builder. And although the same is true for the other Tamiya kits that were released in around the same time, but for the Sheridan in particular, it's even simpler than the other kits from the same generation. So much so that, yes, a beginner can tackle one of these old school Sheridan kits without any problems. This is something that's a bit unique because generally when I make these videos, the models tend to be for an intermediate to an advanced range, and very rarely do I run into a build that is something that a beginner can just start off with who has absolutely no modeling experience. Well, this kit here is one of those models that's an entry-level build, and you could jump into it and have some pretty decent results, even though your skill sets and your tools might not necessarily be that advanced. And needless to say, if a beginner can tackle one of these builds, so can someone with the more advanced skill sets, from the intermediate to the advanced range. Although someone who is an advanced builder might feel that this kit is a bit boring or is overly simplistic for their taste, and if you are an advanced builder, and chances are if you're a certain age range, you've probably tackled one of these kits at some point in your youth. Having said that, however, the point does still stand. One thing that's really cool about these older kits is that they do offer some wiggle room to you, the builder, where you can customize and enhance them from the current configuration that is found with the kit. On this particular example here, you can swap out things like changing out the molded and rear tools, changing out the M2 HB, and, you know, spicing up some of the other surface details that are found on the model, and by doing this, the model's overall quality will improve. But there is the notion that, is it really worth it in the end? And really that's something that's up to the builder's discretion. Because currently on the market there are so many other options available for M551 Sheridans, and those kits do have modern tooling and technology into them, these older kits here would really be best something that you do for fun, or if you have a pile of spare parts on hand and you're looking to do something with them, well, perhaps sprucing up one of these older kits here might be something to look into. Although these old kits here are really easy to put together, unfortunately this does come with a ding to them, and that is with availability. The old school Sheridan kits here have not been in production for nearly as long in comparison to some of the other older kits that are on the market. For instance, this particular example here, being the old school Academy kit, has not been in production since the late 1980s, to say the least. And the Tamiya counterpart isn't that much better. By the time the early 90s rolled on in, this kit was long since retired, and Tamiya themselves would re-release it once or twice during the decades that followed. However, again, in comparison to some of the other kits like the Tamiya Panther A, for instance, this kit here was definitely much more of a rare treat to find in the wild. And with both companies tooling up new versions of the M551 Sheridan, it's highly unlikely that the old tooling kit here will ever be re-released by either company. So because of this, chances are really unlikely that you're going to find one of these while perusing the aisles of your local hobby shop. Unless, of course, you have an extremely dope hobby shop. This is the type of kit that where if you are going to encounter it in the wild, it's going to be from one of these following venues. Either at a flea market, a swap meet, a model show, or, like I did with this one here, off of eBay. Because of the venues that you're going to be finding them in, they can be had in a multitude of different configurations, from virgin mint in the box to partially started to fully completed, painted, and weathered. In addition to that, keep in mind this kit was offered in a multitude of different flavors, so you can find it in static, single motor, and even two-way wire remote. This, of course, isn't just true for the Tamiya kit, but is also relevant for the Academy as well, because Academy did the exact same thing with their releases. It's also noteworthy to point out that this will also affect the price of the kit when found. Moving on to recommendations, if you are a fan of post-World War II American vehicles, the Sheridan is a really noteworthy vehicle in that lineup. Although this vehicle does show its age in some respects, it is still a nice build and is one that will easily enhance your collection. Along those lines, if you're a fan of just American tanks in general, or you really dig vehicles from the Cold War era, this kit here would be a nice addition to your collection. Another person that would appreciate this kit would be anyone who's a fan of building vehicles from the Vietnam War. Although technically this pattern of Sheridan was not the ones that were used in Vietnam, the vehicle itself would still be able to fit into your collection. Another person who I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who's a fan of building fixer-upper type models. If you're the type of person that likes to roll up your sleeves and do a little bit of scratch building or kit bashing, one of these older kits here will definitely fit the bill. And of course, if you're like yours truly and you love to build and collect old school plastic model kits, this one here ticks all those boxes. There is one person who I would not recommend this kit here, and that would be the type of person who is a rivet counting scale perfectionist. You know who you are out there, okay? If you're the type of person that overanalyzes every little aspect of molding and detailing found on these kits, where you compare it to the real one, you make sure it's to size, you make sure it has the right proportions and all that good stuff, this is definitely not going to be the kit for you. This is an old school model kit, no bones about it. And because of that, there's certain aspects of this model here that do show its age and show some deficiencies, specifically in comparison to some of the newer tooling kits that I've already mentioned in this video. If you're one of those type of people, steer well clear from this kit here, and perhaps you might want to stick with something like the new Tamiya M551 Sheridan, or possibly the Ryefield models one. The Academy one I would recommend, however, I've already seen that kit rung over the coals for the reasons that I just mentioned, so perhaps again, that might be one for you to avoid as well. And I'm pretty sure those guys will find something else to complain about because that's what they do, and they're basically unappeasable. So with those miserable folks out of the way, the next person who I would recommend this kit to might be a surprise unless you've watched some of my older school Tamiya build videos, and that would be anyone who's a fan of motorizing or RC converting plastic tank kits. There are a bunch of them on YouTube where they take 1/35 scale models and they rig them up to be fully radio controlled, and it's actually really impressive when they do that. Well, this kit over here is a really good contender for that, for the same reasons that I mentioned on the M60 and on the M48 videos. You see, this one here, since it was originally designed by Tamiya to be motorized converting it is much easier compared to some of the other kits on the market that were designed from the get-go to be static. Because of the motorization ability at first, the model also comes apart in a way that makes it seamless. Again, another great benefit to have if you're looking for that type of a conversion. As we saw earlier, this model was converted to be fully motorized, and this was actually one of the easier conversions that I've accomplished in recent months. If you're clever enough and you find the right microelectronics, you can stuff them into the hull and take this one to the next level from motorization to fully radio controlled. But that's just food for thought for those individuals out there who like to do that type of thing. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35 scale vintage M551 Sheridan build. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or the larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, along with the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been published on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll see you all in the next one. Later.